Good morning, everyone. My name is Marcel, and I'm excited to share with you our empirical study of trusted application rollback prevention on Android smartphones. So I've been working on this with Philipp and Mathias in the Hex Hive laboratory at EPFL. So nowadays on our mobile devices, we deploy a lot of different applications, and they typically process a lot of sensitive data. And they are exposed to different threats, like a malicious app being installed on your device or your device simply being stolen. And what vendors came up with is this idea of having a dedicated and isolated execution context called the trusted execution environment that hosts the most critical services you have on your device, like biometric identification or handling of your PIN pattern password and cryptographic keys in general. And this technology is typically based on ARM Trust Zone. And in this talk, we want to see what happens if one of these trusted modules, also called trusted applications, has a security critical vulnerability. And if you want to convince yourself that these critical vulnerabilities actually exist, I invite you to check out our other talk, which is Global Confusion, where we found a kind of industry-wide pattern of critical vulnerabilities in these trusted applications in the wild. And the funny story is actually that Global Confusion was part of this paper before, but in the review process, when we submitted this first, it got rejected. And one of the reasons was that this now other paper kind of distracted from the narrative of this. So now I'm thankful that it's two papers, and we can kind of have a streamlined narrative in this talk. So trusted applications are these dynamically loadable and authentic modules. Okay, so you have this blob that is signed by the manufacturer, and the loader during runtime takes care that only vendor-signed code is loaded. That brings us to the question, so when we have a security critical vulnerability in one of these trusted applications, we end up in this scenario of rollback attacks. Right? So the vendor goes by, fixes the vulnerability, but suddenly two versions of trusted applications exist. One of them is vulnerable and the other one is not. And nobody prevents an attacker from taking the old, outdated, and vulnerable version and loads this one into the trusted execution environment. And we obviously need to do something about this. And the typical approach, the mitigation here, would be so-called trusted application rollback counters, which work in the way that you have a little header field in these binary blobs that indicates the version, and the loader is implemented in the way that it would only accept the last seen version, which would effectively prevent the loading of outdated trusted applications. And this is basically what all of this talk is about, kind of seeing in the wild out there, is this mitigation actually effectively deployed? Which brings us to our empirical study. So what we did, we created a large data set of Android firmware images, which is composed of 5 OEM vendors that make up 65% of the global market share. We concentrated on firmware images from the last 4 years, and we wanted like a representative data set in the sense that we can see the evolution of trusted applications over time per phone. So we collected at least 5 firmware images per phone. We ended up doing some reverse engineering of the formats with in total 35,500 trusted applications that are deployed on 4 different trusted execution environment implementations out there. Then we created some parsing logic to understand the header metadata, including the rollback counters. We saw in total over all of these trust applications 190 rollback counter change events. And we did like a survey of basically all the vulnerabilities that are publicly known in trusted applications to find a data set containing vulnerable trusted applications. We ended up with about 2,500. And with this data set, we can now look at this ecosystem and make an assessment over the effectiveness of rollback prevention. This is a bit of a different visual representation. On the left, you can see our total amount of trusted applications and the fraction that are vulnerable. And on the right, you can see the vulnerable trusted applications and the amount that actually received a rollback counter increase. And if we simplify this scenario, you can already see that For each vulnerability in a trusted application, you would assume that there would be at least one rollback counter change, and that is by far not the case. So we can kind of conclude that even though public vulnerability advisories exist, so blog posts about basically the proof of concepts to exploit a trusted application, rollback counters are not being used widely in this entire ecosystem. So in our data set, we had the firmware images for 51 devices in total, and our data suggests that 29 of them are actually rollbackable, and you could get your footstep into the trusted execution environment using known exploits. So in our paper, we have some case studies where we actually do this for some of the devices in our data set. And the only vendor in our data set that made use of rollback counters in a more or less systematic way was Samsung. Our paper goes in much more depth about this, and we have these nice visualizations where we show you different phones and the trusted applications that are deployed on them, and a timeline where we show you different events where like firmware updates happened, and we observe if a trusted application had a vulnerability, if it was patched, when an advisory was released, and when the rollback counter was actually changed. So I refer you to the paper if you want to get the detailed data. Now, I want to talk about some of the caveats and some more insights that we had studying this field. We stumbled upon this phenomenon called cross-product leakage. Imagine the following scenario. We have a product of a corporation, the blue phone on the left here, and this yellow phone on the right. And as it is in large corporations, if you're very product-centric, the development of code tends to be decentralized. The code is forked, and in the case of a trusted application, when a bug is found, these decentralized teams work independently on that. One team patches the vulnerability and increases the rollback counter, whereas the other one patches the vulnerability and forgets to increase the rollback counter. So you end up in this scenario where if you just survey the landscape, you and kind of understand what kind of trust applications are shared across products. Only looking at the rollback counter, this will leak information about security critical vulnerabilities and rollback attacks being possible on devices of manufacturers. And we actually saw this in the white wine trust applications, which received a rollback counter update on the Samsung A10, and the Samsung Galaxy S10 did not. The same scenario in like a more relaxed way, if you see this across corporate boundaries. So you have a product of a corporation A and another product of a corporation B, and they end up kind of buying like a third-party trusted applications and maintain the rollback counters themselves. You could end up in the same scenario where a rollback counter is increased by one corporation but not the other. So you have this leakage not only within a corporation but actually across corporate boundaries. So you would threaten other original equipment manufacturers by increasing or making use of this feature in an uncoordinated way. So we did not find a specific case of this cross-OEM leakage, but what we found is that Oppo, Vivo, and Xiaomi, three of the major players in the smartphone market, base some of their phones on the MediaTek chipset. We found that 14 of their trusted applications are actually shared on these platforms. Some of them are actually vulnerable, but what prevented us from finding these cross-OEM leakages is that rollback counters were just not used, or the trusted execution environment that they were using didn't even have the feature to prevent these rollback attacks. But for the future, that's definitely something to keep in mind. With that, I'd like to come to my conclusion. So we saw that trusted application rollback prevention is basically ineffective on an industry-wide scale. We saw some very questionable practices in terms of trust application vulnerabilities where TEs don't have the capability for rollback at all, and that even within companies, this feature of rollback counters is used in an uncoordinated fashion. And in general, it's pretty intransparent from the start to understand if I have a phone in front of me that takes care of this rollback prevention or not. And we encourage vendors to take this kind of extended vulnerability lifecycle into account, where when a vulnerability is introduced to the point where it gets fixed and all the devices receive the patch, that you cannot consider this being fully patched without, in the end, having taken care of rollback prevention. With this, I'm at the end of my talk. You can find the paper online, all the tools that we used, and the aggregated data sets are online on GitHub. We received all the 3 artifact evaluation badges, and I'm happy to answer your questions.